The Marrow King.
An epic dark fantasy tale.
Part 1. The Bone Gardens.
In the kingdom of Valengard, where the mountains met the sea and the forests grew dark and deep, there existed a place that children were warned never to enter. It was called the Bone Gardens, and it lay in a valley between two peaks that seemed to lean toward each other like conspirators sharing secrets.
The gardens had not always been forbidden. Once, centuries ago, they had been beautiful, a place where rare flowers bloomed and nobles came to walk among marble statues and fountains. But that was before the Marrow King claimed them, before the bones began to grow.
Now the gardens were a nightmare made tangible. Trees of calcified bone rose from the earth, their branches hung with skulls instead of fruit. Flowers made of yellowed teeth bloomed in beds of powdered marrow. And at the center of it all stood the Marrow Palace, a castle built entirely from the bones of the dead. Thousands upon thousands of skeletons woven together into walls and towers and spires that gleamed white under the moon.
No one knew exactly what the Marrow King was. Some said he was a necromancer who had discovered the secret of immortality and paid for it with his humanity. Others claimed he was a demon from the deep places of the world, wearing a crown of vertebrae and a robe of rib cages. A few whispered that he had once been human, a king who had loved too deeply and lost too much, and in his grief had made a bargain with death itself. Whatever he was, he ruled the Bone Gardens absolutely, and once every generation he demanded tribute from the kingdom of Valengard.
The tribute was simple. One person, chosen by lottery, would be sent into the Bone Gardens. They would walk the white paths between the bone trees, enter the Marrow Palace, and present themselves to the king. What happened to them after that, no one knew. None of the tributes had ever returned.
But if the tribute was not sent, the Marrow King would emerge from his gardens, and an entire village would disappear overnight. Every person gone, their bones added to his collection, their screams echoing in the valley for days afterward. So Valengard sent its tributes. Every 20 years, one life was sacrificed to spare thousands. It was a grim calculus, but one that every king and queen of Valengard had accepted for the past 3 centuries. Until now. Kael Ashford was 23 years old when her name was drawn from the lottery. She had known it was a possibility, of course. Every citizen of Valengard between the ages of 18 and 40 was entered in the drawing. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were two very different things. When the royal herald read her name in the town square, Kael felt the blood drain from her face. Around her, people stepped back, as though proximity to the chosen might somehow transfer the curse. Her mother screamed. Her father stood frozen, his face gray with shock. Kael herself felt strangely calm. Perhaps it was shock. Or perhaps it was the simple relief of uncertainty being replaced by terrible certainty. The waiting was over. Her fate was decided. She had 2 weeks to prepare before she would be escorted to the edge of the Bone Gardens and sent inside. 2 weeks to say goodbye, to put her affairs in order, to make peace with her death. But Kael did not spend those 2 weeks preparing to die. She spent them preparing to fight.
Kael had always been stubborn, a trait her parents had alternately praised and cursed throughout her childhood. She did not accept things simply because that was how they had always been. She asked questions, challenged assumptions, pushed boundaries. It had made her unpopular with the local priests and beloved by the village children, who saw in her a spirit that refused to be caged.
Now, facing her own death, that stubbornness crystallized into determination. She would not simply walk into the Bone Gardens and accept whatever fate the Marrow King had planned for her. She would learn everything she could about him, about his realm, about his weaknesses, and she would find a way to survive.
The royal archives in the capital city of Valengard were open to all citizens, though few bothered to visit them. Kael spent every day of her 2 weeks there, reading everything she could find about the Marrow King and the tributes that had been sent to him.
The historical records were frustratingly sparse. Most of the tributes were simply listed by name and date, with no additional information. But a few entries were more detailed, written by scholars who had tried to understand what happened in the Bone Gardens.
One account, written 200 years ago, described the testimony of a soldier who had been stationed near the gardens. He claimed to have seen one of the tributes, a young man named Thomas, walking back out of the gardens 3 days after entering. But before the soldier could reach him, Thomas had collapsed. When they examined his body, they found that every bone in his body had been replaced by perfect replicas carved from white marble. He was still alive, still breathing, but unable to move or speak. He died within hours.
Another account mentioned a group of scholars who had tried to study the gardens from a distance using telescopes and other instruments. They reported seeing the tribute enter the Marrow Palace and never emerge. But for weeks afterward, they claimed to see a figure moving in the palace windows, sometimes human-shaped, sometimes not, always watching the world beyond the gardens with what the scholars described as hungry curiosity.
The most disturbing account was the most recent, written 50 years ago by a court wizard who had been trying to divine the Marrow King's nature through magical means. He wrote,
"The king is not alive, but neither is he dead. He exists in the space between states, sustained by a power I cannot identify, but which feels ancient and wrong. He collects bones not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. They are the only thing that allows him to maintain his form, to interact with the physical world. Without them, he would dissolve back into whatever void spawned him. The tributes serve a similar purpose, though I dare not speculate on the exact mechanism. What I can say with certainty is this: the Marrow King is lonely, profoundly, cosmically lonely, and that loneliness is more dangerous than any malice could be."
Kael read that passage 3 times, committing it to memory. Lonely. Not evil necessarily, but lonely. Could loneliness be negotiated with? Could it be exploited?
She also researched the structure of the Bone Gardens themselves. Old maps showed the layout as it had been before the transformation, a central palace surrounded by concentric rings of gardens, each with its own theme and aesthetic. If that structure still held, then there would be a clear path from the entrance to the palace. But there would also be side paths, hidden routes, places where someone clever might hide or explore. On her last day before the tribute, Kael visited the city's best blacksmith and commissioned a special knife. It was small, easily concealed, and made from iron that had been blessed by 7 different priests in 7 different faiths. She didn't know if blessed iron would be effective against whatever the Marrow King was, but it couldn't hurt. She also visited an old woman who lived on the outskirts of the city, a hedge witch who claimed to know the old magics that predated the kingdom itself. The woman gave Kael a small pouch filled with herbs and bone dust.
"Scatter this in a circle around yourself if you need protection," the witch said. "It won't hold against anything truly powerful, but it might buy you time. And take this." She pressed a small stone into Kael's palm, smooth, black, shot through with veins of silver. "It's called a truth stone. Hold it when someone speaks, and you'll know if they're lying. But be careful. The truth is not always what you want to hear."
Kael thanked her and left, tucking both gifts safely away. The night before the tribute, her parents held a farewell dinner. It was a somber affair, with too much food and too little conversation. Kael's younger brother, Eric, barely spoke, his eyes red from crying. Her mother kept touching Kael's hand, as though trying to memorize the feeling of her daughter's skin. Her father sat stiff and silent, his jaw clenched so tight Kael worried his teeth might crack. "I'm going to come back," Kael said, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "I don't intend to die in those gardens." "No one ever intends to die," her father said quietly. "But they die anyway."
"Not me," Kael insisted. "I'm going to find a way."
She didn't know if she believed it, but she needed them to believe it, needed to give them something to hold on to besides grief. The next morning, a contingent of royal guards arrived to escort her to the Bone Gardens. The journey took 3 days on horseback, traveling north through forests that grew progressively darker and more silent. Birds stopped singing, animals fled. Even the wind seemed to whisper warnings. On the 3rd day, they reached the valley. The Bone Gardens stretched before them, impossibly vast, a landscape of white and gray under a sky that seemed perpetually overcast, despite the bright sun shining everywhere else. The bone trees rose like skeletal hands reaching for the heavens. The paths between them glowed faintly, as though lit from beneath.
And at the center, dominating the valley, stood the Marrow Palace.
It was grotesque and magnificent in equal measure. Every surface was bone, walls of woven ribs, towers of stacked vertebrae, battlements made from interlocking pelvises and shoulder blades. Skulls stared from every window, their empty eye sockets seeming to track the movements of the living. The main gate was a massive jawbone, its teeth forming a portcullis that was currently raised.
Kael dismounted from her horse and stood at the edge of the gardens, at the point where the natural forest ended and the bone forest began. Behind her, the guards maintained a respectful distance, none willing to get too close to the boundary. "This is where we leave you," the captain of the guard said, his voice gruff with discomfort. "May the gods watch over you, Miss Ashford."
"I don't need the gods to watch over me," Kael replied, checking her knife one last time. "I'll watch over myself."
She stepped across the boundary and into the Bone Gardens. The change was immediate and disorienting. The air became colder, thicker, harder to breathe. Sound was muffled, as though she were underwater, and beneath her feet, the path felt wrong, soft and slightly yielding, more like walking on skin than stone. Kael forced herself to move forward, following the main path toward the palace. On either side, the bone trees loomed, their branches creaking softly, despite the absence of wind. Some of the skulls hanging from them still had scraps of hair or flesh clinging to them, slowly decaying. Others were clean and polished, gleaming like porcelain. As she walked, Kael became aware that she was not alone. Shapes moved in her peripheral vision, pale figures that darted between the trees, never quite solid, never quite there. Ghosts, perhaps, of previous tributes, or something worse. She kept her hand on her knife and her eyes forward. The path led through several of the garden's rings, each more unsettling than the last. The ring of teeth, where the ground was carpeted in molars and incisors that crunched beneath her feet. The ring of fingers, where skeletal hands emerged from the earth, their digits curled as though beckoning. The ring of spines, where columns made from vertebrae rose like the pillars of some profane temple. Finally, after what felt like hours but might have been minutes, time seemed unreliable here, Kael reached the palace gates. Up close, the jawbone gate was even more massive than it had appeared from a distance. Each tooth was the size of her torso,
yellowed and cracked with age. As she approached, the jaw began to move, opening wider, inviting her inside. Kael took a deep breath, touched the truth stone in her pocket for reassurance, and stepped through. The interior of the Marrow Palace was surprisingly ornate. The bone walls were carved with intricate designs, scenes of battles and harvests, celebrations and sorrows, the entire history of humanity rendered in calcium and cartilage. Chandeliers made from finger bones hung from the ceiling, lit by a sourceless pale light. The floor was polished smooth, made from countless skulls fitted together like cobblestones, their faces all turned upward, all screaming silently.
Kael walked through empty halls, her footsteps echoing. She passed rooms filled with bone furniture, bone decorations, bone everything. A throne room where a seat made from pelvises and femurs sat empty. A dining hall with a table that could seat 50, set with plates made from shoulder blades. A library where the books were bound in what looked disturbingly like human leather, their pages made from pressed and dried skin.
"Hello?" Kael called out, her voice sounding small in the vast spaces. "I'm here. I'm the tribute. Show yourself."
Silence answered her. But it was not an empty silence. It was the silence of something listening, something waiting.
Kael continued deeper into the palace, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. She climbed a spiral staircase made from spines, each step vertebra after vertebra, and emerged in a tower room at the palace's highest point.
The room was circular, with windows looking out over the entire bone gardens. In its center stood a figure.
At first, Kael thought it was a statue, a sculpture of a man made entirely from bone. But then it moved, turning to face her with a fluid grace that no statue could possess. This was the Marrow King. He was tall, impossibly tall, built from the bones of dozens or perhaps hundreds of people. His skull was human-shaped, but scaled up, with eye sockets large enough to fit fists. His spine was a column of interlocking vertebrae that seemed to have too many segments. His limbs were composite assemblies of multiple arm and leg bones, creating appendages that were functionally human, but aesthetically wrong. He wore a crown made from finger bones, arranged in a delicate filigree that would have been beautiful if it weren't so disturbing. And when he spoke, his voice came not from his mouth, but from everywhere at once, resonating through the bones of the palace itself.
"Welcome, tribute," the Marrow King said. "You are the 152nd person to enter my gardens, and you are the first to climb to this tower of your own will, rather than being brought here as a prisoner."
Kael forced herself to meet his empty gaze, to look directly into those vast eye sockets, despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. "I came to negotiate."
The king tilted his skull, a gesture that might have been curiosity or amusement. "Negotiate? How novel! And what do you imagine you have that I might want?"
Kael pulled out the truth stone and held it up. "I want to know the truth. Why do you demand these tributes? What do you do with them? And is there a way for me to leave here alive?" The Marrow King was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound like wind whistling through hollow bones, beautiful and terrible.
"You bring a truth stone to my domain," he said, "to a place built entirely on the remains of truth, where every bone tells the story of a life ended. Very well, I will tell you truth, though you may find it harder to bear than lies would be."
He moved to the window, his movements accompanied by soft clicking sounds as bone slid against bone. "I was human once, long ago, before this kingdom existed, before the old empire fell. I was a king named Aldrich.
I ruled a small realm in these very mountains, and I was happy.
What happened? Kael asked.
I fell in love, the Marrow King said simply, with a woman named Ilara. She was kind and clever and beautiful, and she loved me in return. We married, ruled together, built a palace in the valley below. The Bone Gardens were our private retreat, a place of beauty and peace. He paused, and Kael heard something like pain in his resonating voice. Then plague came to our kingdom. It took Ilara first, then our children, then nearly everyone. I watched them die, one by one, unable to save them. The palace became a tomb, the gardens a graveyard.
And you? Kael asked quietly.
I could not accept it, the Marrow King said. I searched for ways to bring them back, to undo death itself. I made bargains with things that should not be bargained with. I studied forbidden arts, and eventually I found a ritual that promised to restore the dead to life.
It didn't work, Kael guessed.
It worked, the Marrow King corrected, but not as I intended. The ritual required a sacrifice, my own life, my own flesh, given willingly to death in exchange for those I loved. I performed it, expecting to trade my existence for theirs. Instead, he gestured at his skeletal form. Death accepted my flesh, but not my soul. I was transformed into this, stripped of everything human except my consciousness. And those I tried to save? Their bodies rose, animated by the ritual's power, but their souls were gone. They were just bones, walking and moving, but empty.
Kael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. So all of this, the Bone Gardens, the palace,
was my desperate attempt to keep them with me, the Marrow King finished. I shaped their remains into something beautiful, tried to preserve what little was left. But bones alone are not enough. They decay, crumble, turn to dust. I needed more, always more, to maintain what I had built.
The tributes, Kael said, understanding dawning.
Yes, every 20 years I take one person. I add their bones to my collection, use them to repair what time has damaged. It is a terrible thing, I know, but without it, I would lose even the pale shadow of my family that remains. The palace would collapse, the gardens would turn to dust, and I would be truly alone, with nothing left of the life I once had.
Kael pulled out the Truth Stone and held it while the Marrow King spoke. It remained cool and still in her palm. He was telling the truth, every word.
That's why you're lonely, she said. Not cruel, just unbearably lonely.
For 300 years I have existed in this half-state, the Marrow King said, neither alive nor dead, surrounded by the remains of those I loved, but unable to truly be with them. The tributes, I don't enjoy taking them, but I need them, and in return, I protect Valengard from other threats, keep darker things from emerging from the deep places. It is a bargain, cold and cruel, but necessary.
There has to be another way, Kael said.
If there is, I have not found it in 3 centuries of searching.
Kael thought about everything she had learned, about the lonely king cursed by his own love, about the terrible mathematics of sacrifice, one life every generation, versus the countless lives he had saved by keeping other horrors at bay.
What happens to the tributes? She asked. Specifically, what do you do with them?
The Marrow King turned away from the window, his skull facing her directly. I offer them a choice. They can die quickly and painlessly, their bones taken and their souls released. Or, he hesitated, or they can stay with me. become part of the palace, part of the gardens. Their consciousness merged with the structure itself. Their awareness spread across bone and marrow. They would not be alive, but neither would they be truly dead. They would exist as I do, in the space between.
And have any chosen that? Kael asked, though she suspected she knew the answer.
One, the Marrow King said, 120 years ago. A woman named Miranda. She was a scholar, fascinated by death and what lay beyond. She chose to stay. Her bones form the Eastern Tower, and sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear her thoughts echoing through the structure. She does not regret her choice, I think, but neither does she recommend it.
Kael absorbed this information, her mind racing. There had to be a solution, some way to break the cycle without condemning the Marrow King to complete dissolution or continuing the tribute tradition forever.
What if, she said slowly, there was a way to give you what you need without taking lives? What if we could provide bones willingly from those already dead?
The Marrow King shook his head. I have tried. The dead must be fresh, the bones still resonant with the life they held. Once a body has been buried for even a week, the bones are useless to me, and grave robbing would be no more acceptable than what I do now.
Then what about those who choose it? Kael pressed. What if Valengard established a tradition where those near death, the elderly, the terminally ill, could volunteer to give their bones to you after they pass? It would still be a tribute, but one freely given rather than taken by lottery.
The Marrow King was silent for a long moment, considering. It might work, he said finally, if enough volunteered. I need perhaps 10 skeletons every 20 years to maintain what I have built. If that many were freely given, then the lottery could end, Kael finished. No more forced tributes, no more families torn apart.
And what about you? The Marrow King asked. You are here now, the tribute for this generation. Even if your plan works for the future, someone must still fulfill the bargain for today. Kael had known this question was coming. She took a deep breath. I'll stay.
What?
I'll be the tribute, but not as a skeleton, as Miranda was, as part of the structure. I'll merge my consciousness with the palace, help you maintain it, and in return, you'll work with Valengard to establish the volunteer system. When enough have volunteered, when the palace is secure, you'll release me. Let me return to my life.
That could take decades, the Marrow King warned, and there's no guarantee the transition back would be possible.
I know, Kael said, but it's better than dying, and it ends the forced tribute forever. It's worth the risk. The Marrow King studied her with his empty eye sockets. You are either very brave or very foolish.
Probably both, Kael admitted, but I'm also very stubborn, and I'm not ready to die yet.
Very well, the Marrow King said. I accept your terms. But know this, once you become part of the palace, you will experience things no living human was meant to experience. You will feel the weight of every bone, hear the echoes of every soul that has passed through here. It will not be pleasant.
Nothing worthwhile ever is, Kael replied.
The ritual took place at midnight in the throne room. The Marrow King arranged 13 circles of bone dust on the floor, each one representing a different aspect of death and transformation. Kael stood in the center, surrounded by those circles, holding a small piece of her own bone, a tooth she had lost as a child and kept as a keepsake.
The Marrow King chanted in a language that predated human speech, words that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of decay and preservation. The bone circles began to glow with pale light, and Kael felt herself beginning to change.
It didn't hurt exactly. It was more like unraveling.
Her sense of self began to expand, to spread outward from her physical form. She could feel the bones of the palace, every skull and femur and rib. She could sense the presence of Miranda in the eastern tower, a consciousness like her own, but more diffused, stretched thin across hundreds of bones.
And she could feel the Marrow King's loneliness, 300 years of isolation, of loving and losing, of existing in the terrible space between life and death.
"I'm here," she thought, projecting the words toward him. "You're not alone anymore."
"Thank you," came his reply, and there was genuine gratitude in it. "Thank you for choosing this."
The transformation completed, and Kael found herself existing in 2 states simultaneously. Her body remained standing in the throne room, but her consciousness was now spread throughout the entire palace. She was the walls and the floors, the towers and the gardens. She could see through every window, hear every sound, feel the weight of centuries pressing down.
It was overwhelming, terrifying, magnificent.
And she was not alone. The Marrow King was there, his presence vast and ancient. And Miranda was there too, reaching out to welcome her.
"It gets easier," Miranda's thought voice said. "The first days are the hardest, but you adjust, and it's not so bad, really. There's a strange beauty to it, seeing the world from this perspective."
"How long have you been here?" Kael asked.
120 years, though time feels different when you're made of stone and bone. Sometimes a year passes in a moment. Sometimes a moment lasts a century.
"Do you regret it?"
Sometimes, but mostly no. I've learned things no living human could know. I've seen the world change in ways both beautiful and terrible. And when I finally let go, when I choose to move on, I'll do so with knowledge that will illuminate whatever comes next."
Kael let that thought settle, finding comfort in it.
In the days that followed, though days were hard to track when you were made of palace, the Marrow King sent a message to Valengard's capital. He explained the new arrangement, the terms Kael had negotiated. The kingdom was skeptical at first, but as months passed and volunteers began to come forward, elderly people wanting their deaths to serve a purpose, the terminally ill seeking meaning in their final days, the system began to work.
It took 7 years for enough volunteers to provide the bones the Marrow King needed. 7 years during which Kael existed as part of the palace, experiencing the slow passage of time in a way no human normally could. She watched seasons change, saw storms batter the gardens and sunlight illuminate them. She felt the arrival of each new volunteer, their bones carefully added to the structure, their final gift freely given.
And slowly, the Marrow King began to change. The loneliness that had defined him for 3 centuries began to ease. He had companions now, Kael and Miranda, and the others who had stayed with him. He was no longer alone.
When the 7th year ended, when the palace was secure and no more forced tributes would be necessary, the Marrow King kept his promise. The reverse ritual was even more complex than the first. It took 3 nights of chanting, of carefully unwinding Kael's consciousness from the bones it had verged with, of gathering her sense of self back into her waiting body.
When it was done, Kael opened her eyes and found herself lying on the throne room floor, gasping for air, her heart pounding. She was human again, mortal again, small and finite and gloriously, terrifyingly alive. The Marrow King stood over her, offering a skeletal hand to help her up. "Welcome back," he said. "You kept your bargain. I have kept mine."
Kael took his hand and stood on shaky legs. "What will you do now?"
"Continue," the Marrow King said simply. "Maintain the gardens. Watch over Valengard as I have for 3 centuries. But I will do so with companions now, with those who chose to stay rather than those who were forced. It is a better existence than I had before."
"And someday," Kael asked, "will you ever be able to move on, to join Elara and the others wherever they are?"
The Marrow King was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps, when the world no longer needs me, when the dark things that lurk in the deep places have been forgotten or destroyed, then maybe I can let go. But until that day, I will keep my watch."
Kael nodded, understanding. She had kept watch herself for 7 years. She knew what it meant to hold vigil against darkness.
Part 2. The Return.
When Kael walked out of the Bone Gardens 7 years after entering them, she found her family waiting at the boundary. They had never stopped waiting, her father told her through tears. Every day for 7 years, at least one member of the family had come to the forest's edge, hoping against hope that she would emerge.
Her return was celebrated throughout Valengard. She was the first tribute in 300 years to leave the Bone Gardens alive, and the story she brought back of the lonely king and his terrible burden, of the new arrangement she had negotiated, spread quickly through the kingdom. Kael spent the remaining years of her long life as an ambassador of sorts, traveling between Valengard's capital and the Bone Gardens, facilitating the volunteer program, ensuring that the Marrow King received what he needed, while respecting the dignity of those who chose to give.
She also kept a record, writing down everything she had learned and experienced during her 7 years as part of the palace. The Memoir of Bones, she called it, and it became one of the most important texts in Valengard's history.
In her old age, when her bones began to ache and her strength began to fail, Kael made a final journey to the Bone Gardens. She walked the white paths between the bone trees, entered the Marrow Palace, and climbed the spiral staircase to the tower room where she had first met the king.
He was there, as she had known he would be, watching the sun set over his realm of bones.
"I've come to volunteer," she said simply.
The Marrow King turned to face her. "You've done enough already, more than anyone could ask." "I know," Kael said, "but I want to do this. When I was part of the palace before, I felt something, a peace I've never found in the mortal world. And I learned from Miranda that when we finally choose to move on, when we release our hold on the bones we've merged with, we take with us knowledge of death that illuminates whatever comes after. I want that knowledge. I want to understand."
"You would give up your final years?"
"I've lived a full life. 83 years, longer than most. My family has grown, my legacy is secure. Now I want to rest, but not in a grave, here as part of something larger."
The Marrow King studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well, but this time there will be no reversal. When you merge with the palace, you will remain until you choose to move on completely. Are you certain?"
"I'm certain," Kael said. The ritual was familiar this time. The spreading of consciousness, the expanding of self beyond the boundaries of flesh. Kael felt herself merge with the palace once again, felt her awareness spread through bone and marrow. And this time she didn't fight it. She embraced it, welcomed the transformation.
"Welcome back," came Miranda's thought voice, warm with genuine pleasure. "I knew you'd return someday."
"How long until you move on?"
Kael asked her.
"Soon," Miranda replied. "I've learned what I needed to learn. I'm ready. But I wanted to wait for you, to make sure the king wouldn't be alone."
"He won't be," Kael assured her. "There are others now, the volunteers and more who will come. He'll never be alone again."
"Good," Miranda said. "Then I can go in peace."
That night, Miranda released her hold on the eastern tower. Her consciousness dissolved, moving on to whatever came after death, taking with her the knowledge she had gained from 2 centuries of watching and waiting. The bones she had been merged with remained, but they were just bones now, empty of the spirit that had animated them.
Kael felt the absence like losing a friend, but she also felt something else, a profound rightness to the cycle. Life, death, transformation, transcendence. The Marrow King understood it, had lived it for centuries. Now Kael understood it too.
She spent her time as part of the palace, watching the world change. Valengard prospered, grew, evolved. The volunteer tradition continued, and the Marrow King became less feared and more respected. A strange guardian, certainly, but a guardian nonetheless.
And slowly, over the decades, Kael felt her understanding deepening. She learned the language of bones, the stories written in calcium and collagen. She learned to hear the echoes of lives past, to understand the patterns that connected all living things.
She learned, most importantly, that death was not an ending but a transformation, that the boundaries between states, living and dead, matter and spirit, self and other, were more permeable than most people realized. When she finally felt ready to move on, when she had learned everything she could from her time in the palace, she said goodbye to the Marrow King.
"Thank you," he said, "for giving me companionship, for changing the bargain, for showing me that even in this cursed existence, connection is possible."
"Thank you," Kael replied, "for teaching me that love can survive anything, even death, even transformation, even 300 years of loneliness. What you built here is terrible and beautiful and true."
She released her hold on the bones, felt her consciousness beginning to dissolve, to move toward whatever came next, and in her final moment as part of the palace, she felt something extraordinary, a connection to all the other souls who had passed through the bone gardens, all the volunteers who had given themselves freely, all the tributes who had come before her.
They were waiting for her on the other side, a community of spirits who had learned the same lessons she had, who understood the same truths.
And leading them was a woman with kind eyes, Elara, the Marrow King's lost love, still watching over him even from beyond death.
"Tell him," Elara said, "that I'm proud of him, that what he built, though born from grief, has become something more, a bridge between worlds, a place where the living and dead can meet and understand each other. Tell him that when he's ready, I'll be here, waiting."
Kael carried that message back to the Marrow King in the moment before she fully transitioned. She felt his gratitude, his relief, his joy at knowing Elara still existed somewhere, still loved him. Then she let go completely and moved on. Epilogue: The Living Palace. 300 years after Kael's death, the bone gardens still stood in their valley between the mountains. The Marrow King still ruled there. Though he had changed over the centuries, he was no longer alone, no longer defined by loneliness. The palace was full now, dozens of volunteers who had chosen to merge their consciousness with its structure, creating a community unlike any other in the world. The gardens had become a pilgrimage site, a place where people came to meditate on death and transformation. Scholars studied the Memoir of Bones and debated its philosophical implications. Artists came to draw the bone trees and capture their terrible beauty. And sometimes, very rarely, someone would arrive at the palace gates with a request. They would climb to the tower room and speak with the Marrow King, and they would ask if they could stay, not as bones, but as consciousness, as part of the living palace. Some were accepted, others were gently turned away, told they had more life to live before they would be ready for such transformation. And deep within the structure of the palace, in the bones that formed its foundation, the spirits of Kael and Miranda and all the others waited and watched. They were no longer quite human, no longer quite separate from each other. They had become something new, a collective consciousness that spanned the boundary between life and death, a bridge between worlds.
The Marrow King was still lonely, sometimes. 300 years was a long time, even with companions. But it was a different loneliness now, not the crushing isolation of his early centuries, but the melancholy awareness of someone who had lived too long, seen too much, carried too heavy a burden for too many years.
Still, he kept his watch, kept the dark things at bay, maintained the gardens and the palace, and waited for the day when the world would no longer need him, when he could finally let go and cross the boundary himself, to join Alara and all the others who waited on the far shore.
That day would come, eventually. All things ended, even the longest vigils, even the most stubborn loves.
But until then, the Marrow King would remain.
And in the bone gardens, the dead would continue to dream, and the living would continue to remember, and the boundary between would continue to thin, teaching all who came there the truth that Kael had learned in her 7 years as part of the palace.
That death was not an ending, but a transformation.
That love could survive anything.
And that even in the darkest places, even in gardens made of bones and palaces made of sorrow, there could be beauty, connection, and hope.
The watch continued.
The gardens grew. And the Marrow King, no longer quite so lonely, ruled over his realm of transformation with the wisdom of one who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that letting go did not mean forgetting, and that endings were also beginnings, and that even in death there was life.
The end.